Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. So today, we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of you have probably heard about and maybe been curious about, and that's dry needling.
Okay.
We are going to be trying to sort of figure out what it is, how it works, and how it relates to acupuncture.
Right.
We've got a really great article here from Nuno Lemos, who is an acupuncturist in Portugal.
Okay.
And he makes a pretty strong case that dry needling is actually just a form of acupuncture.
Yeah, it's so interesting how much confusion there is around this whole topic. Like,
Hmm.
Lengos actually starts his article with this anecdote about a patient. The patient was seeing a physiotherapist, and this physiotherapist was very adamant that dry needling was not acupuncture
Oh, wow.
at all.
Yeah.
And it really highlights how this is a real debate that's happening out in the world.
Yeah,
It even impacts patient care.
right. Yeah. It's like, well, where do we even begin if we can't agree on what it is that we're talking about? So how does he sort of like break down this argument? Like, what is his main point?
Well, he lays out these 6 key points
Okay.
to support his claim that it is a form of acupuncture. And he starts off by going back to the basics.
Okay.
So he really just focuses on, he kind of dissects the definition of dry needling.
Okay.
And he emphasizes, it means no liquid is injected,
Right.
just like in traditional acupuncture.
Okay.
It's all about the needle.
Okay. So no magic potions, just the needle itself.
All right.
But he doesn't stop there, right? He goes on to talk about like the tools of the trade as well.
Exactly. So he really points out that if a practitioner is using acupuncture needles, then they are, by definition, practicing acupuncture.
Hmm.
It's the procedure that defines the practice, not the name
Hmm.
we give it, right? He even talks about how, like, acupuncture needles get rebranded as puncture needles or physiotherapy needles. And it
Interesting.
seems like it's more about marketing than actual differences in the tools themselves.
So it's like calling a rose by another name. It's still a rose. Right. But here's a question I have. What about these specific acupuncture points that we always hear about? Are those used in dry needling?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. So Lemos actually challenges this common belief that acupuncture is solely about hitting those specific points.
Okay.
And he kind of reminds us that with over 4,000 documented acupuncture points, you could argue that any point on the body could potentially be an acupuncture point.
Wow.
It's not always as simple as hitting a specific target.
Okay, that's kind of a mind bender. So there's a lot more nuance to it than I think we realize at first.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And to further dismantle this points-only myth, he actually takes us back in time. He sort of explores these historical roots of acupuncture
Okay.
and highlights that traditionally, acupuncture didn't always revolve around those well-known meridian points. He even mentions that what we now call trigger points, those knots that you might feel in your muscles, were actually described in early Chinese medical texts centuries ago.
Hmm. It's amazing how these ancient practices are still relevant today. And, even influencing modern therapies. So if it's not all about specific points, how does traditional Chinese acupuncture classify these different spots on the body?
So Lemos breaks down like the 3 main categories of points in traditional Chinese acupuncture.
Yeah.
First, you have your regular points, which I think are the ones that most people are familiar with, located along the meridian lines. Then there's these extra points, which are outside the meridian system but still have specific locations and functions. And then lastly, there are ashi points.
Ashi points? Yeah, I've heard that term before. Aren't those kind of like those tender spots that can sort of pop up anywhere?
Precisely.
Okay.
Ashi points are those pender spots that aren't necessarily tied to specific anatomical locations.
Right.
They're unique to each individual and can change, based on various factors.
So even within traditional Chinese medicine, there's an acknowledgement of points beyond those classic meridian points.
Yeah.
That definitely lends a lot of weight to his argument. But what about those who say that dry needling is like a separate invention of modern physiotherapy?
Yeah, so Lemos tackles that head on. He cites sources like Brav and Sigmund, who as far back as 1941 linked dry needling to acupuncture techniques. He even quotes Peter Baldry, a renowned researcher in dry needling, who points to a technique described in the ancient text, the Huang Ti Nai Ching, that sounds remarkably similar to modern dry needling practices.
So it's like discovering that your favorite song is actually like a cover of a much older tune.
Exactly.
It changes your whole understanding of its origins and evolution.
Yeah, and I think that's a really key takeaway from Lemos's argument, is that this attempt to separate dry needling from acupuncture seems to be a relatively recent phenomenon,
Hmm.
perhaps driven by professional interests rather than genuine differences in technique.
Okay, so we've established that dry needling is, dry by definition. It
Mhm.
uses the same tools as acupuncture, and it has, like, deeper historical connections than we might have realized at first. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. Limos also addresses some pretty compelling counter-arguments to his claims in the comment section of his article.
Right.
So let's dive into those next. It's always so fascinating to see how experts respond to, critiques and alternative viewpoints. It's like a bonus layer of learning. So what kind of pushback did Lemos get on his article?
Well, one commenter, Osni Sakamoto, brought up some really interesting points. He argued that dry needling and acupuncture should be distinguished based on their reasoning and their insertion methods.
Okay, so Sakamoto is suggesting that there are like fundamental differences in how these techniques are approached and applied.
Right.
What were his specific arguments?
So, for example, Sakamoto pointed out that while dry needling aims to deactivate trigger points, acupuncture focuses on circulating liver goals. He saw this as a key distinction in their therapeutic goals.
Hmm, circulating liver key. For those of us who aren't super familiar with traditional Chinese medicine, can you break that down a little bit? What does that actually mean?
Sure. It's important to understand that qi is a really complex concept in Chinese medicine. It's often translated as vital energy or life force, but it's not a physical substance that can be measured in a lab. It's more of a concept that describes the flow of energy throughout the body.
So it's more of an energetic framework for understanding health and how the body functions.
Right. And in traditional Chinese medicine, the liver is associated with the smooth flow of qi throughout the body. So when we talk about circulating liver qi, we're really talking about making sure that energy is moving freely and harmoniously, which is seen as essential for overall well-being.
Okay, that makes sense. So Sakamoto sees this focus on qi as a key difference between dry needling and acupuncture.
Mm.
How does Lemos respond to that?
Well, Lemos argues that kind of reducing the concept of circulating liver qi to a purely physiological process, or just like energy, is a bit of a westernized interpretation. He emphasizes that in the context of acupuncture, it's a more nuanced concept that encompasses both physical and energetic aspects.
So Lemos is saying that maybe the language we use to describe these techniques might not fully capture, like, the complexity of what's happening at a deeper level.
Exactly. And this leads into Lemos's response to another point Sakamoto raised about needle insertion. Sakamoto suggested that traditional acupuncture targets the space between muscles, while dry needling goes directly through the muscle.
Oh, that seems like a pretty clear-cut distinction, but is it really that simple?
Lemos pushes back on that oversimplification.
Hmm.
He explains that traditional acupuncture doesn't actually have a strict rule about avoiding intramuscular needling.
Okay.
The depth and the angle of insertion can vary greatly depending on the desired therapeutic effect.
So there's more flexibility and nuance in the needling technique within traditional acupuncture than some people might assume.
Absolutely. Lemos points out that deep needling techniques, sometimes even reaching the bone, have long been a part of acupuncture practice. And remember those ashy points we talked about? Well, those are often located within muscles and might require deeper needling to achieve the desired results.
Okay, so it's not as simple as between versus through when it comes to needle placement. There's a whole spectrum of techniques being employed. What was Sakamoto's final point of distinction?
His last point was that the reasoning behind point selection differs between the two approaches.
Okay.
He felt that dry needling is more focused on localized pain relief by targeting trigger points, while acupuncture takes a more holistic approach, considering the overall balance of qi in the body.
That does seem to align with the common perception of these two practices. How did Lemos address this one?
Well, Lemos acknowledges that dry needling, as it's practiced today, often does focus on deactivating trigger points to alleviate musculoskeletal pain. But he argues that this doesn't necessarily negate its connection to acupuncture. He even points out that acupuncture practitioners commonly use dry needling techniques, especially when addressing pain conditions.
So it seems like there's a lot of overlap in how these techniques are actually applied in clinical settings, despite these attempts to draw like these hard lines between them.
Exactly. And I think this is where Lemos's overarching point really comes into focus.
Okay.
He suggests that framing dry needling as this completely separate entity from acupuncture is a bit like saying that a square isn't a rectangle.
Oh, I see what you mean. A square might have unique characteristics, but it still falls under the broader definition of a rectangle. So Lemus is saying that dry needling, while distinct in some ways, still fundamentally belongs to that larger family of acupuncture practices.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's a key takeaway for anyone trying to understand this whole debate. It's not about two completely separate entities, but rather about how we categorize and understand the evolution of techniques within this long-standing tradition.
So it really seems like this whole debate over dry needling and acupuncture isn't so much about the techniques themselves, but more about like their history and terminology and even professional territories.
Right, and you can really see how that can lead to a lot of confusion, not just amongst practitioners, but also for patients. Like the one Lumos mentioned, who was told by their physiotherapist that what they were receiving wasn't actually acupuncture.
And as we've been exploring, Lemos argues, I think pretty convincingly, that dismissing dry needling as completely separate from acupuncture is kind of like it's based on this limited understanding of acupuncture's history and how diverse it's been and how much it's evolved over time.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, what's important for everyone listening to take away from this deep dive is that this categorization of dry needling, it's complex, it's nuanced.
Right.
There's a valid argument to be made that it is a part of the broader spectrum of acupuncture, even if it is considered, a distinct technique within that spectrum.
But as you said earlier, does the label really matter as much as the outcome? What do you think?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, if dry needling, regardless of what we call it, is effective in treating pain and it's practiced safely and ethically by a qualified professional, then maybe the debate over the name is less crucial than making sure that it's being applied responsibly.
Yeah, that's such a good point. It really shifts the focus from like semantics to what truly matters, right? Which is patient safety and well-being.
Exactly.
And it reminds us, as people who are trying to understand this stuff, to be critical consumers of the information that's out there. Question those assumptions that we might have and look beyond just the labels to really try and understand the deeper context.
For sure. And Lemos leaves us with, I think, a final, really thought-provoking question to ponder. He asks, knowing this historical and technical connection, how does this change your view of the current debate over who owns dry needling? Does it even matter what we call it, as long as it's effective and practiced safely?
Wow, that's a really powerful question that encourages us to, move beyond this black and white thinking and just kind of embrace the complexities of, healthcare practices.
Yeah.
And I think, today we've only just dipped our toes into this really fascinating topic, and hopefully this deep dive has kind of sparked your curiosity to explore it even further.
Absolutely. There's always more to learn and discover. And remember, the best deep dives are the ones that challenge our perspectives and open our minds to new possibilities.